Hello and welcome to Bookspot. This time we'll continue our reading of The Rolling Stones by Robert Heinlein. Chapter 18 The Worm in the Mud. Cost accounting on the Flat Cat deal turned out to be complicated. The creatures were all descendants of Fuzzy Britches, chattel of Lowell, but the increase was directly attributable to food fed to them by everyone, which in turn had forced them to eat most of the luxury foods stocked by the twins for trade. But it had been the twins' imaginative initiative which had turned a liability into an asset. On the other hand, they had used freely the capital goods, ship and electronic equipment belonging to the entire family. But how to figure the probable worth of the consumed luxury food? Whatever the figure was, it was not just original cost plus lift fuel. Roger Stone handed down Solomon's decision. From the gross proceedings would be subtracted Meade's percentage for singing. The twins would be reimbursed for the trade goods that had been commandeered. The balance would be split three ways among the twins and Lowell, all to be settled after they had traded high grade for refined metal at Ceres, then sold their load at Luna. In the meantime, he agreed to advance the twins' money to operate further, Fries having promised to honor his site draft on Luna City National. But for once, the twins found no immediate way to invest money. They toyed with the idea of using their time to prospect on their own, but a few trips out in the scooter convinced them that it was a game for experts, and one in which even the experts usually made only a bare living. It was the fixed illusion that the next mass would be the glory rock, the one that would pay for years of toil, that kept the old rock men going. The twins knew too much about statistics now, and they believed in their ability rather than their luck. Finding a glory rock was a sheer gamble. They made one fairly long trip into the thickest part of the node, 1,500 miles out and back, taking all one day and following night to do it. They got the scooter up to a dawdling 150 miles per hour and stop and investigate if they found promising masses, having borrowed a stakeout beacon from Fries with a promise that they would pay for it if they kept it. They did not need it. Time after time, they would spot a major blip on the stereo radar only to have someone else's beacon wink on when they got within 30 miles of the mass. At the far end, they did find a considerable collection of rock traveling loosely in company. They matched, shackled on their longest lines, their father had emphatically forbidden free jumping, and investigated. Having neither experience nor a centrifuge, their only way of checking on specific gravity was by grasping a mass and clutching it to themselves vigorously, thus getting a rough notion of its inertia by its resistance to being shoved around. A Geiger counter, borrowed, had shown no radioactivity. They were searching for the more valuable core material. 2 hours of this exercise left them tired but no richer. Grandpa, announced Pollux, this is a lot of leftover country rock. Not even that. Most of it's pumice, I'd say. Get for home? Check. They turned the scooter around by flywheel and homed on the City Hall beacon, boosting it up to 400 miles per hour before letting it coast, that being the top maneuver they could figure on for the juice they had left in their tanks. They would have preferred to break the speed limit, being uneasily aware that they were late and being anxious to get home. The best designed suit is not comfortable for too many long periods. They knew that their parents would not be especially worried. While they were out of range for their suit radios, they had reported in by the gossip grapevine earlier. Their father was not worried, but the twins spent the next week under hatches confined to the ship for failing to get back on time. For a longer period, nothing more notable took place than the incident in which Roger Stone lost his breathing mask while taking a shower and almost drowned, so he claimed, before he could find the water cutoff valve. There are very few tasks easier to do in a gravity field than in free fall, but bathing is one of them. Dr. Stone continued her practice, now somewhat reduced. Sometimes she was chauffeured by the miner assigned to that duty. Sometimes the twins took her around. One morning, following her office hours in City Hall, she came back to the Stone looking for the twins. Where are the boys? Haven't seen them since breakfast, answered Hazel. Why? Dr. Stone frowned slightly. Nothing really. I'll ask Mr. Fries to call a scooter for me. Got to make a call? I'll take you, unless those lunks have taken our scooter. You needn't, Mother Hazel. I'd enjoy it. I've been promising Lowell a ride for weeks, or will it take too long? Shouldn't. It's only 800 miles out or so. The doctor was not held down to the local speed limit in her errands of mercy. Do it in 2 hours with juice to spare. Off they went with Buster much excited. Hazel allotted one-fourth her fuel as safety margin, allotted the working balance for maximum accelerations, figuring the projected mass ratios in her head. Quite aside from the doctor's privilege to disregard the law, high speed was not dangerous in the sector they would be in, it being a thin volume of the node. Their destination was an antiquated winged rocker, the wings of which had been torched off and welded into a tent-shaped annex to give more living room. Hazel thought that it had a shanty town air, but so did many of the ships in Rock City. She was pleased enough to go inside and have a sack of tea and let Lowell out of his spacesuit for a time. The patient, Mr. Eakers, was in a traction splint. His wife could not pilot their scooter, which was why Dr. Stone granted the house call. Dr. Stone received a call by radio while they were there. She came back into the general room looking troubled. "Smatter?" inquired Hazel. "Mrs. Silva, I'm not really surprised. It's her first child. Did you get the coordinates and the beacon pattern? I'll run you right over." Lowell? Oh, yes. It would be a long time in a suit for a youngster. Mrs. Eakers suggested they leave the child with her. Before Lowell could cloud up at the suggestion, Dr. Stone said, "Thanks, but it isn't necessary. Mr. Silva is on his way here. What I'm trying to say, Mother Hazel, is that I probably had better go with him and let you and Lowell go back alone. Do you mind?" "Of course not. Pipe down, Lowell. I'll have us home in 3/4 of an hour, and Lowell can have his nap or his spanking on time, as the case may be." She gave Dr. Stone one or two spare oxygen bottles before she left. Dr. Stone refused to take both of them. Hazel worked the new mass figures over. With Edith, her suit, and the spare bottles subtracted, she had spare fuel. Better hit it up pretty fast and get home before the brat got cranky. She lined up on City Hall by flywheel and stereo, spun on that axis to get the sun out of her eyes, clutched her gyros, and gave it the gun. The next thing she knew, she was tumbling like a liner in free fall. She remembered from long habit to cut the throttle, but only after a period of aimless acceleration, for she had been chucked around in her saddle, thrown against her belts, and could not at first find the throttle. When they were in free fall again, she remembered to laugh. "Some ride, hey, Lowell? Do it again, Grandma." "I hope not." Quickly, she checked things over. There was not much that could go wrong with the little craft, it being only a rocket motor, an open rack with saddles and safety harness, and a minimum of instruments and controls. It was the gyros, of course. The motor had been sweet and hot. They were hunting the least bit, she found, that being the only evidence that they had just tumbled violently. Delicately, she adjusted them by hand, putting her helmet against the case so she could hear what she was doing. Only then did she try to find out where they were and where they were going. Let's see. The sun is over there, and that's Betelgeuse over yonder, so City Hall must be out that way. She ducked her helmet into the hemispherical eye shade of the stereo. Yep, there she be. The Eakers place was the obvious close by point on which to measure her vector. She looked around for it, was startled to discover how far away it was. They must have coasted quite a distance while she fiddled with the gyros. She measured the vector in amount and direction, then whistled. There were, she thought, few grocery shops out that way, darn few neighbors of any sort. She decided that it might be smart to call Mrs. Eakers and tell her what had happened and ask her to call City Hall, just in case. She could not raise Mrs. Eakers. The sloven, she thought bitterly, had probably switched off her alarm so she could sleep. Lazy baggage. Her house looked it and smelled it too. But she kept trying to call Mrs. Eakers or anyone else in range of her suit radio while she again lined up the ship for City, with offset to compensate for the new vector. She was cautious and most alert this time. In consequence, she wasted only a few seconds of fuel when the gyros again tumbled. She unclutched the gyros, put them out of her mind, and took careful measure of the situation. The Eakers dump was now a planetary light in the sky, shrinking almost noticeably, but it was still the proper local reference point. She did not like the vector she got. As always, she seemed to be standing still in the exact center of a starry globe, but her instruments showed them speeding for empty space, headed clear outside the node. What's the matter, Grandma Hazel? Nothing, son, nothing. Grandma has to stop and look at some road signs, that's all. She was thinking that she would gladly swap her chance of eternal bliss for an automatic distress signal and a beacon. She reached over, switched off the child's receiver, then repeatedly called for help. No answer. She switched Lowell's receiver back on. Why'd you do that, Grandma Hazel? Nothing, just checking it. You can't fool me. You're scared. Why? Not scared, Pet. Worried a little, maybe. Now shut up. Grandma's got work to do. Carefully, she lined up the craft by flywheel. Carefully, she checked it when it tried to swing past. She aimed both to offset the new and disastrous vector and to create a vector for City Hall. She intentionally left the gyros unclutched. Then she restrapped Lowell in his saddle, checked its position. Hold still, she warned. Move your little finger and Grandma will scalp you. Just as carefully, she positioned herself, considering lever arms, masses, and angular moments in her head. Without gyros, the craft must be balanced just so. Now, she said to herself, Hazel, we find out whether you are a pilot or just a Sunday pilot. She ducked her helmet into her eye shade, picked a distant blip on which to center her crosshairs, and gunned the craft. The blip wavered. She tried to rebalance by shifting her body. When the blip suddenly slipped off to one side, she cut the throttle quickly. Again, she checked her vector. Their situation was somewhat improved. Again, she called for help, not stopping to cut the child out of hearing. He said nothing and looked grave. She went through the same routine, cutting power again when the craft fell off its tail. She measured the vector, called for help, and did it again. A dozen times she tried it. On the last try, the thrust stopped, with the throttle still wide open. With all the fuel gone, there was no need to be in a hurry. She measured her vector most carefully on the Eaker's ship, now far away, then checked the results against the City Hall blip, all the while calling for help. She ran through the figures again. In a fashion, she had been successful. They were now unquestionably headed for City Hall, could not miss it by more than a few miles at most, almost jumping distance. But while the vector was correct in direction, it was annoyingly small in quantity, 650 miles at about 40 miles an hour. They would be closest in about 16 hours. She wondered whether Edith really had needed that other spare oxygen bottle. Her own gauge showed about half full. She called for help again, then decided to go through the problem once more. Maybe she had dropped a decimal in her head. While she was lined up on City Hall, the tiny light in the stereo tank faded and died. Her language caused Lowell to inquire, What's the matter now, Grandma? Nothing more that I should have expected, I guess. Some days, hon, it isn't worthwhile to wake up in the morning. The trouble, she found, was so simple as to be beyond repair. The stereo radar would no longer work because all three cartridges in the power pack were dead. She was forced to admit that she had been using it rather continuously, and it took a lot of power. Grandma Hazel, I want to go home. She pulled out of her troubled thoughts to answer the child. We are going home, dear, but it's going to take quite a while. I want to go home right now. I'm sorry, but you can't. But shut it up, or when I get you out of that sack, I'll give you something to yelp for. I mean it. She again called for help. Lowell made one of his lightning changes to serenity. That's better, approved Hazel. Want to play a game of chess? No. Sissy, you're afraid I'll beat you. I'll bet you 3 spanks and a knuckle rub. Lowell considered this. I get the white men? Take 'em. I'll beat you anyhow. To her surprise, she did. It was a long, drawn-out game. Lowell was not as practiced as she was in visualizing a board, and they had had to recount the moves on several occasions before he would concede an arrangement of men. And between each pair of moves, she had again called for help. About the middle of the game, she found it necessary to remove her oxygen bottle and replace it with the one spare. She and the child had started out even, but Lowell's small mass demanded much less oxygen. How about another one? Want to get your revenge? No, I want to go home. We're going home, dear. How soon? Well, it'll be a while yet. I'll tell you a story. What story? How about the one about the worm that crawled up out of the mud? Oh, I know that one. I'm tired of it. There's parts I've never told you, and you can't get tired of it, not really, because there's never any end to it. Always something new. So she told him again about the worm that crawled up out of the slime, not because it didn't have enough to eat, not because it wasn't nice and warm and comfortable down in the under the water, but because the worm was restless. How it crawled up on dry land and grew legs. How part of it got to be the elephant's child, and part of it got to be a monkey, grew hands and fiddled with things. How, still instantly restless, it grew wings and reached up for the stars. She spun it out a long, long time, pausing occasionally to call for aid. The child was either bored and ignored her or liked it and kept quiet on that account. But when she stopped, he said, "Tell me another one." "Not just now, dear." His oxygen gauge showed empty. "Go on, tell me a new one, a better one." "Not now, dear. That's the best story Hazel knows, the very best. I told it to you because I want you to remember it." She watched his anoxia warning signal turn red, then quietly disconnected the partly filled bottle on her own suit, closing the now useless suit valves, and replaced his empty bottle with hers. For a moment, she considered cross connecting the bottle to both suits, then shrugged and let it stand. "Lowell?" "What, Grandma?" "Listen to me, dear. You've heard me calling for help. You've got to do it now, every few minutes, all the time." "Why?" "Because Hazel is tired, dear. Hazel has to sleep. Promise me you'll do it." "Oh, all right." She tried to hold perfectly still, to breathe as little of the air left in her suit as possible. It wasn't so bad, she thought. She had wanted to see the rings, but there wasn't much else she'd missed. She supposed everyone had his Carcassonne. She had no regrets. "Grandma! Grandma Hazel!" She did not answer. He waited, then began to cry, endlessly and without hope. Dr. Stone arrived back at the Rolling Stone to find only her husband there. She greeted him and added, "Where's Hazel, dear, and Lowell?" "Hey, didn't they come back with you? I suppose they'd stopped in the store." "No, of course not." "Why, of course not?" She explained the arrangement. He looked at her in stunned astonishment. "They left the same time you did?" "They intended to. Hazel said she would be home in 45 minutes." "And there's a bare possibility they're still with the Eakers. We'll find out." He lunged toward the door. The twins returned to find their home and City Hall as well in turmoil. They had been spending an interesting and instructive several hours with old Charlie. Their father turned away from the Stones' radio and demanded, "Where have you two been?" "Just over in Charlie's hole. What's the trouble?" Dr. Roger Stone explained. The twins looked at each other. "Dad," Cassier said painfully, "you mean Hazel took Mother out in our scooter?" "Certainly." The twins questioned each other wordlessly again. "Why shouldn't she? Speak up." "Well, you see, well, it was like this." "Speak up." "There was a bearing wobble or something in one of the gyros," Pollux admitted miserably. "We were working on it." "You were? In Charlie's place?" "Well, we went over there to see what he had in the way of spare parts, and, well, we got detained, sort of." Their father looked at them for several seconds with no expression of any sort. He then said in a flat voice, "You left a piece of ship's equipment out of commission. You failed to log it. You failed to report it to the captain." He paused. "Go to your room." "But Dad, we want to help." "Stay in your room. You are under arrest." The twins did as they were ordered. While they waited, the whole of Rock City was alerted. The word went out. The doctor's little boy is missing. The boy's grandmother is missing. Fuel up your scooters. Stand by to help. Stay on this wavelength. "Paul, quit jittering." Pollux turned to his brother. "How can I help it? They can't be lost, not really lost, or the stereo itself would stand out on a screen like a searchlight." Pollux thought about it. "I don't know. You remember I said I thought we might have a high potential puncture in the power pack? I thought you fixed that." I planned to, just as soon as we got the bugs smoothed out in the gyros. Castor thought about it. That's bad. That could be really bad, he added suddenly. But quit jittering just the same. Start thinking instead. What happened? We've got to reconstruct it. What happened? Are you kidding? Look, the pesky thing tumbles, then anything can happen. No control. Use your head, I said. What would Hazel do in this situation? They both kept quiet for some moments. Then Pollock said, Cass, that darn thing always tumbled to the left, didn't it? Always? Well, what good does that do us? Left can be any direction. No, you asked what Hazel would do. She'd be along her homing line, of course, and Hazel always oriented around her drive line so as to get the sun on the back of her neck if possible. Her eyes aren't too good. Castor screwed up his face trying to visualize it. Say Eakers is off that way and City Hall over there. If the sun is over on this side, then when it tumbles, she'd vector off that way. He acted it with his hands. Sure, sure, when you put in the right coordinates, that is, but what else could she do? What would you do? She'd vector back. I mean, vector home. Huh? How could she with no gyros? Think about it. Would you quit? Hazel is a pilot. She'd ride that thing like a broomstick. He shaped the air with his hands. So she'd be coming back or trying to along here, and everybody will be looking for her way over there. Castor scowled. Could be. It had better be. They'll be looking for her in a cone with its vertex at Eakers, and they ought to be looking in a cone with its vertex right here and along one side of it at that. Come along, said Castor. Dad said we were under arrest. Come along. City Hall was empty save for Mrs. Fries, who was standing watch, red-eyed and tense, at the radio. She shook her head. Nothing yet. Where can we find a scooter? You can't. Everybody is out searching. Castor tugged at Pollock's sleeve. Old Charlie. Huh? Say, Mrs. Fries, is old Charlie out searching? I doubt if he knows about it. They rushed into their suits, cycled by spilling and wasting air, did not bother with safety lines. Old Charlie let them in. What's all the fuss about, boys? Castor explained. Charlie shook his head. That's too bad. That really is. I'm right sorry, Charlie. You've got to have your scooter. Right now, added Pollux. Charlie looked astonished. Are you fooling? I'm the only one can gun that rig. Charlie, this is serious. We've got to have it. You couldn't gun it. We're both pilots. Charlie scratched meditatively while Castor considered slugging him for the keys, but his keys probably weren't on him, and how would anyone find anything in that trash pile? Charlie finally said, If you've just got to, I suppose I better gun it for you. Okay, hurry up, get your suit on. Don't be in such a rush, it just slows you down. Charlie disappeared into the underbrush, came out fairly promptly with a suit that seemed to consist mostly of vulcanized patches. Dog take it, he complained as he began to struggle with it. If your mother would stay home and mind her own business, these things wouldn't happen. Shut up and hurry. I am hurrying. She made me take a bath. I don't need no doctors. All the bugs ever bit me died. When Charlie had dug his scooter out of the floating junkyard moored to his home, they soon saw why he had refused to lend it. It seemed probable that no one else could possibly pilot it. Not only was it a vintage type, repaired with parts from many other sorts, but also the controls were arranged for a man with 4 hands. Charlie had been in free fall so long that he used his feet almost as readily for grasping and handling as does an ape. His spacesuit had had the feet thereof modified so he could grasp things between big toe and second, as with Japanese stockings. Hang on, where are we going? Do you know where the Eakers live? Sure, used to live out past that way myself. Lonely stretch. He pointed. Right out there, about half a degree right of that little second magnitude star, say 810 miles. Cass, maybe we better check the drift reports in the store. Charlie seemed annoyed. I know Rock City. I keep up with the drifts. I have to. Then let's go. To Eakers? No, just about. He strained his neck, figured the position of the sun, tried to imagine himself in Hazel's suit, heading back. About there, would you say, Paul? As near as we can guess it. The crate was old, but Charlie had exceptionally large tanks on it. It could maintain a thrust for plenty of change of motion. Its jet felt as sweet as any, but it had no radar of any sort. Charlie, how do you tell where you are in this thing? That That proved to be an antiquated radio compass loop. The twins had never seen one, knew how it worked only by theory. They were radar pilots, not used to conning with the seat of their pants. Seeing their faces, Charlie added, Shucks, if you've got any eye for angle, you don't need fancy gear. Anywhere within 20 miles of the city hall, I don't even turn my jet suit on. I just jump. They cruised out on the line the twins had picked. Once in free fall, Charlie taught them how to handle the compass loop. Just plug it into your suit in place of your regular receiver. You just pick up a signal when you swing the loop and pick when it's least loud. That's the direction of the signal. An arrow right through the middle of the loop. But which way? The loop faces both ways. You have to know that. Or guess wrong and go back and try again. Castor took the first watch. He got plenty of signals. The node was buzzing with talk, all bad news. He found, too, that the loop, while not as directional as a salad bowl antenna, usually did not pick up but one signal at a time. As they scooted along, endlessly he swung the loop, staying with each signal just long enough to be sure it did not sound like Hazel. Pollux tapped his arm and put his helmet in contact with Castor's. Anything? Just chatter. Keep trying. We'll stay out here until we find them. Want me to spell you? No, if we don't find them, I'm not going back. Quit being a cheap hero and listen, or give me that loop. City Hall dropped astern until it was no longer a shape. Castor at last reluctantly gave over the watch to Pollux. His twin had been at it for perhaps 10 minutes when he suddenly made motions waving them to silence, even though he could not have heard them in any case. Castor spoke to him helmet to helmet. What is it? Sounds like a kid crying. Might have been Buster. Where? I lost it. I tried to get a minimum. Now I can't raise it. Charlie, anticipating what would be needed, had swung his ship as soon as he had quit accelerating. Now he blasted back as much as he had accelerated, bringing them dead in space relative to City Hall and the node. He gave it a gentle extra bump to send them cruising slowly back the way they had come. Pollux listened, slowly swinging his loop. Castor strained his eyes, trying to see something, anything other than the cold stars. Got it again, Pollux pounded his brother. Old Charlie killed the relative motion, waited. Pollux cautiously tried for a minimum, then swung the loop, then tried again. He pointed, indicated that it had come by one of two directions, 180 degrees apart. Which way? Castor asked Charlie. Over that way. I can't see anything. Me neither. I got a hunch. Castor did not argue. Either direction was equally likely. Charlie gunned it hard in the direction he had picked, roughly toward Vega. He had hardly cut the gun and let it coast in freefall when Pollux was nodding vigorously. They coasted for some minutes, with Pollux reporting the signal stronger and the minimum sharper, but still nothing in sight. Castor longed for radar, but now he could hear crying with his own phones. It could be Buster. It must be Buster. There she is! It was Charlie's shout. Castor could not see anything, even though old Charlie pointed it out to him. At last he got it, a point of light buried in stars. Pollux unplugged from the compass when it was clear that what they saw was a mass, not a star, and in the proper direction. Old Charlie handled his craft as casually as a bicycle, bringing them up to it fast and killing his headway so that they were dead with it. He insisted on making the jump himself. Lowell was too hysterical to be coherent. Seeing that he was alive and not hurt, they turned at once to Hazel. She was still strapped in her seat, eyes open, a characteristic half smile on her face, but she neither greeted them nor answered. Charlie looked at her and shook his head. Not a chance, boy. She ain't even wearing an oxygen bottle. Nevertheless, they hooked a bottle to her suit, Castor's bottle. No one had thought to bring a spare. The twins went back cross-connected on what was left of Pollux's bottle, temporarily Siamese twins. The family scooter they left in orbit to be picked up and towed in by someone else. Charlie used almost all his fuel on the way back, gunning it to as high a speed as he dared while saving boost to break them at City Hall. They shouted the news all the way back. Somewhere along the line, someone picked up their signal and passed it along. They took her into Fry's store, there being more room there. Mrs. Fry's pushed the twins aside and applied artificial respiration herself, to be displaced 10 minutes later by Dr. Stone. She used the free fall method without strapping down, placing herself behind Hazel and rhythmically squeezing her ribs with both arms. It seemed that all of Rock City wanted to come inside. Fry's chased them out and, for the first time in history, barred the doors to his store. After a while, Dr. Stone swapped off with her husband, then took back the task after only a few minutes' rest. Meade was weeping silently. Old Charlie was wringing his hands and looking out of place and unhappy. Dr. Stone worked with set face, her features hardened to masculine professional lines. Lowell, his hand in Meade's, was dry-eyed but distressed, not understanding, not yet knowing death. Castor's mouth was twisted, crying heavily as a man cries, the sobs wrung from him. Pollock's, emotion already exhausted, was silent. When Edith Stone relieved him, Roger Stone backed away, turned toward the others. His face was without anger, but without hope. Pollux whispered, Dad, is she? Roger Stone then noticed them, came over, and put an arm around Castor's heaving shoulders. You must remember, boys, that she is very old. They don't have much comeback at her age. Hazel's eyes opened. Who doesn't, boy? And we'll find out how Hazel's doing next time.